Cast your minds back about 12 months. 2023 saw Brazil once again put a stranglehold on the Siege Pro League, with both Major and SI Grand Finals featuring only Brazilian teams. In all three tournaments, won by a single team. Nothing could stop Brazil last year, and they were spearheaded by W7M, who had the single most successful season by a single roster in the history of Siege. There's a reason why the word dynasty was thrown around quite liberally after their World Championship win. 2024 wasn't quite as successful. With the SI winning roster now at Furia, Brazil wasn't quite able to replicate that same success they had last year. Nevertheless, we still have 5 teams from Brazil at SI this year, and it's the usual suspects: Faze Clan, W7's new roster, Team Liquid, and Furia Esports, as well as a new team in RazaH Company. So can Brazil go back-to-back and win the region's third world title? Let's start with the runners-up at last year's SI in Sao Paulo, Faze Clan. This team is consistently at the top of the league in Brazil and has gone to a great number of international events in the team's history. However, they have only won a LAN event only the once, and that was Sweden back in 2021. There's almost always some kind of a wrinkle that prevents them from winning an international tournament, and this was best exemplified at SI last year. Map 5 of the Grand Final, Faze were up 6-1. Map, Series, and Championship point firmly in hand. They had 5 chances to close out in regulation, but they could not get it over the line as they watched W7M claw back the round deficit, force overtime, and snatch the hammer from them when they had their fingertips on it.
It's all directed to the... Is this the moment where we can crown a new champion, a new dynasty to be created? And we will!
That has got to hurt. Faze Clan did continue their domestic dominance from last year, with first place in both stages of the Brazil League. And while they weren't able to make the playoff bracket in both majors, both their runs came up short for different reasons. Their quarterfinals exit in Manchester came off the back of Beast Coast surprising everyone at that major, and then going on to win the whole damn thing. And they came up short against BDS in the semis at Montreal. And you can't say it's down to any sort of roster change, because this squad has remained the same since mid-2023, when Rafael came in to replace the outgoing Ramalho as coach. So the roster consists of Cyber, Souls, Vidiking, Handy, and KDS. This lineup is very good on paper, and both Cyber and Souls were part of that Sweden major winning roster. We know they have the goods on LAN, they've done it before. But the problem is the squad itself, or rather, something about this squad. A good way to describe Faze Clan is consistently good, but not good enough. Or to put it another way, always a bridesmaid, never the bride. There's something about the mentality of this team that actively prevents it from claiming another international LAN trophy. Whether it's their ruthlessness or lack thereof, they have a bad day, the worst time possible, or they come up against some kind of mental barrier. You can't really put a finger on it. I have no doubt the Faze Clan will make it deep at SI this year, maybe even make the main stage once again. But they're going to have the ghost of SI past lingering over their shoulders after their heartbreaking Grand Final loss last year. If they truly want to make amends, then they need to exercise those demons and come into this SI firing on all cylinders. Next up in our rankings is W7M. No, not that roster. They've moved on to another org, and we'll be talking about them later on. This is a whole new roster that got picked up after Los dropped the entire squad when it was announced that they would be heading to North America for 2024. Why? Fuck if I know. In any case, Los didn't have a good showing at last year's SI, and that was with Cameraman and Maya on the team as well. It's at this point that the org announced its plans to move regions, and that was when W7M swooped in to pick up the remainder of the roster, alongside the returning Volps and Dodes. So the roster for this SI consists of Dash, Dots, Dodes, Loban, and Volps. That's not a bad squad on paper, but it did take a little bit to really get going, with 4th place in Stage 1 of Brazil, losing to Furia in the 3rd place match. Not too shabby for your first outing against the reigning World Championship roster. But then they go to EWC, and to everyone's surprise, they made it to the Grand Final, only to capitulate against BDS in a 3-0 drubbing. Not the result they were after, but it did put the rest of the world on notice. This was them saying, we may not be a championship roster, but we can still hang with the best in the world. And then they continued that form and momentum going into Stage 2 of Brazil, with 3rd place, getting payback against Furia in the process. Even so, no one really expected this W7M roster to make any sort of a deep run in Montreal. But they surprised everyone and won the whole damn thing over BDS, completing a revenge arc from the EWC, and making amends from Atlanta when they fell just short against, well, themselves. Like with Faze, W7M are going to have ghosts hovering them, but for different reasons. This roster is coming into Invite with the same org that won SI just 12 months ago. The same roster that won both majors of 2023. That roster is now with Furia, but this new roster has an immense weight on their shoulders. I would not be surprised if they ended up making the main stage at SI, given their Montreal major win and how dominant they were in that grand final. But I would also not be surprised if they fell short either. The expectation is on their shoulders, and it may be too much for them. We shall see come Boston. And now for one of the oldest and most prestigious teams in Brazil, Team Liquid. This team, like Faze Clan, is forever present in the top flight of Brazilian Siege, and it's not hard to see why when they've had some of the best players in history on their books. However, that has never truly translated into international success. The best it has ever come was second at the 2021 Invitational when they lost an emotional grand final to Ninjas in Pajamas. So can Liquid finally break their duck? With Volps on the roster for last year's SI, Liquid survived the group of death and made it into the upper bracket, but then get knocked down into the lowers by Dark Zero. They were able to bounce back with a dominant showing against Team Falcons. However, they got matched up against the 2023 World Champions in G2 and couldn't cope. While not their worst showing at the Invitational, it was definitely not up to the level we expect from a team like Liquid. So they decided to drop Volps after Invite and bring in Maya for the new season. However, things didn't really work out for them in Stage 1 with 8th, missing out on the playoffs and needing to go through the qualified gauntlet to make it through to Manchester, which they did, in spite of their semi-final match against W7M needing all 3 maps. It was here that things began to turn for Liquid, because despite them starting in the play-ins and being one of 2 teams to send G2 packing, they made it all the way to the semis of Manchester. And if it weren't for the surprise packet of Beast Coast, I reckon they would have made it all the way to the grand final. Having a fairly successful EWC campaign where they made it up to the semi-finals, Liquid then reset for Stage 2 of the Brazil League, where they performed considerably better than they did with Stage 1, and pulled second behind Faze Clan. However, their Montreal campaign was nowhere near as successful. They ended up getting eliminated in the final round of groups, although you could chalk that up to several other teams doing considerably better than most people expected them to. Palu, Nask, Resets, Lagonis, and Maya are all going to Boston with a point to prove this year. This is arguably the strongest this roster has ever looked in a long time, probably since SI21. Not to mention that Palu and Nask have poured their hearts and souls into this team since its inception, and it's a long time their hard work finally bears fruit. But I fear if they can't get it right this year, then there's some drastic changes coming in the new season. I still think Liquid will go deep, but the jury's still out on whether or not they can finally lift the hammer. I, for one, sincerely want that to happen, purely for Palu's sake. And now we come to the current World Champions, or more accurately, the World Championship winning roster. Because after W7M let Herds, KZ, Felipox, Nade, and JV92 go following SI in Sao Paulo, Furia scooped them up for the new season. 2023 was the year this 5-stack made history, winning every premier tournament in the season and cementing their dynasty as the most successful team in history. However, 2024 was far from successful. I don't think I need to remind you that this roster walked away with the hammer following their incredible comeback in the grand final, because I already covered that with Faze Clan. That win was reminiscent of Penta's win in 2018 against Evil Geniuses, with Fabian's now famous spray to his teammates where they were 2-0 down going into the map 3. 2024's SI will go down in history in the same way. But, just as their new dynasty was cemented, the now Furia roster could not keep up that same form going into the new season. Things didn't start off too badly, with 3rd place in Brazil Stage 1, beating their old org in W7M on their way to booking their place in Manchester. And while they did make the playoff bracket, they met their fellow countrymen in Team Liquid and quarters and lost. Okay, not great, but the silver lining here is that no team that has won SI in recent history has ever won the first major of the following season, so no real harm done there. After a somewhat successful EWC campaign where they lost in the semis to BDS, they returned to Brazil for Stage 2, where they would end up in the 3rd place match against W7M for the 2nd time this year. Only this time, W7M had the last laugh, and forced Furia to compete in the LCQ with 4th place. They were 1 map away from Montreal in the grand final of the LCQ against Black Dragons, but they could not get it over the line on Skyscraper. As a result, they had to wait at home to see if they would retain their place at SI and have a chance to run it back for Boston. And with a little bit of luck on their side, Furia qualified for 25, and they capped off the domestic season with 2nd place in the BR Premier Finals. The Unkillable Bulls of 2023 are still one of the best rosters in Brazil, even if their results don't necessarily show it. But with Furia having a target painted on their chests and their backs against the wall, it's on them to dig deep and show us why they are the reigning world champions. Despite them not making the Montreal Major, I still reckon they have a solid shot of lifting the hammer again in 2025. And the last team to make it to SI from Brazil is a somewhat familiar roster with a fresh coat of paint. This is RazaH Company, or more accurately, the former E1 Sports roster. After E1 announced that it was pulling out of Siege, Flashery, STK, Pesero, Live, and Perez all joined the newly reformed RazaH Company. And for their first outing in their new org, they actually did pretty damn good, beating both Keatstars and Black Dragons twice to qualify for Boston through the Brazilian and South American LCQ. However, in the interest of fairness, we should probably have a look at their results when they were under the E1 banner. Let's begin with Stage 1 Brazil. With Arthur and Emps on the roster, they surprised everyone and got 2nd place, sending them straight to Manchester Phase 2. Phenomenal result for them. But then they got to Manchester and went 0-3, losing to Team Bliss, PSG, and Kagosaka in that order. Not the greatest of finishes. So during the mid-year transfer window, Arthur and Emps leave the team and Pesero and Live come in to help bolster this roster. Unfortunately, it didn't really work. 5th place overall in Stage 2 of Brazil, and got knocked out in the LCQ in quarters by Black Dragons. E1 did round out this domestic comp with a semi-final elimination in the BR Premier Finals. But then they announced not long after that they were pulling out of Siege. RazaH Company is coming into this SI with little to no expectations on their shoulders. And for every single one of these guys, this will be their first ever Invitational, which is going to be a huge experience for this 5-stack. The problem is they're coming up against heavyweight teams not just from their home region in Brazil, but also Europe and North America. If they don't make it out of groups, I wouldn't be all that surprised. And I think many people have them pegged as the weakest team from Brazil at this SI. However, the weakest team from Brazil is still better than average compared to the rest of the world. If we were to look at all 20 teams going to Boston, the top 5 in my opinion will be dominated by Brazil. I reckon Faze Clan, Furia, and Team Liquid all have a solid chance of going back-to-back for Brazil this year. Though, if I'm being honest, the competition should be a lot closer this year compared to last year. W7M should be good enough to go deep into the playoff bracket this year, but I don't think they'll make the main stage. RazaH Company, I feel, is the wild card here. I just don't know where to place them in terms of my own personal rankings. Despite all that, if we were to look at Brazil as a region, it is still one of the strongest regions within Siege, and I honestly would not be shocked if the grand final was all Brazilian again. That is it for Brazil and South America's delegation for SI 2025. Do you think Brazil has a chance of lifting the hammer again this year? Let me know in the comments below who you think will place the highest from Brazil this year. Next up is the home crowd favorites of North America. Until next time, operators, this is your resident Silverwolf, signing out.